Penny Stamp's Distinguished Speaker Series. Today we present a veritable cult heroine and bona fide genius, cartoonist Alison Bechdel. Hear that, Alison? A big thank you to our partners today, as this program is actually a co-presentation with the Institute for the Humanities, which is celebrating a year dedicated to life writing, and the Institute for Research on Women and Gender in celebration of its 20th anniversary year, and the Zell Visiting Writers Series, and Michigan Radio 91.7 FM. Today marks our very first ever opportunity to partner with the Zell Visiting Writers Series, which I find momentous, as I know many Penny Stamps patrons who often find themselves in a dilemma on Thursdays, as they're pulled in two directions by our simultaneous programs. So a special welcome to Zell patrons who have never made it to a Penny Stamp series. We're very happy to have this be a Zell and Penny Stamps moment, and I do hope something can be done at some point to uncouple our scheduling. However, I'm thrilled we have this moment to meld. So just keeping things complicated and not to do away with dual geography, today's event is actually an extended and progressive event, meaning that we will go on and be in another location. Following the talk here, there is going to be an exhibition opening around the corner and up the street at the Institute for the Humanities, where they have mounted, yes, it is super exciting. I'm very excited about it. They have mounted an exhibition featuring Alison's work entitled Dykes, Dads, and Moms to Watch Out For. This installation is the first ever comprehensive exhibition of Alison's work and archive, including original drawings, prints, posters, historic letters, and papers, all housed in a Victorian-like parlor setting. Very intriguing, so please do join us. And while you're there, you can actually also take in the held over pop-up exhibition of Phoebe Gluckner's artwork, Stamp School's own graphic novelist. Her work from Diary of a Teenage Girl, which incidentally will make its premiere as a film this Saturday at Sundance. Lots of good things. Both exhibitions are up through February 25th, Bechdel in the main gallery, Gluckner next door in the Osterman Common Room, but you should definitely join us today and see them with the artists. This is a remarkable moment to see all of this work, and I do want to give kudos to Amanda Krugliak, who is the Institute's ardent curator. She has her finger on the pulse. As I was thinking about, this seems a transcendent moment for cartoonists and the graphic novel, both making their leaps onto the Broadway stage, onto the silver screen, and then considering the recent terror in Paris just a few weeks ago, followed by immense demonstrations and the public solidarity of Je suis Charlie. The power of the cartoon is undeniable. So, in light of all of that, there will be no Q&A today. But you can meet Alison, so please join us at the Institute for Humanities directly following the talk. It's a very short walk if you don't know how to do it. Go out the theater doors, go up to State Street, take a left, and then you take a right on Washington, and at the next corner, you'll be at Thayer in Washington, you'll find yourselves at the Institute. If you can't remember that, it's okay, because we have Common Language Books is selling books in the lobby, and they have also managed to print little maps for people to make it to the Institute. They have books for sale in the lobby here. They will also be selling books at the Institute for Humanities, where Alison will also be happy to sign your book. So, good things to come. Please do remember to turn off your cell phones. And now for a proper introduction of Alison Bechdel, please welcome the director of the Institute for the Humanities, the Mary Fair Crowshore Professor of Humanities, and great partner to the series here, Sydney Smith.
Thank you, Christina. For many of us, Alison Bechdel needs no introduction. She is the creator of the widely lauded comic strip Dykes to Watch Out For, which ran from 1983 to 2008. The strip remains a veritable generation-long chronicle and became what Ms. Magazine called one of the preeminent oeuvres in the comics genre. She is also the wielder of the Bechdel test. In a 1985 Dykes strip called The Rule, Bechdel made popular a simple test for giving a thumbs up or thumbs down movie reviews. The criteria for a thumbs up review are 3. It has to have at least 2 women in it who talk to each other about something besides a man. The test went viral on social media in 2011. And Bechdel is now an amazing graphic memoirist. In 2006, Bechdel's graphic memoir, Fun Home, a Family Tragicomic, hit the bookstores and then hit college classrooms across the campus. The sheer brilliance, evocative charge, and endlessly fascinating play of gutters and frames through this long-form memoir expanded her readership here and abroad. A complex exploration of erotic truth, gendered relations, and generational affiliations in the American family, Fun Home is deeply invested in imaging and imagining those intricate, intersubjective acts of storytelling that both bind and rend families. This graphic memoir entwines the story of Bechdel's coming of age and coming out with the daughter's narrative of her father's sexual double life and early death. Readers have found all kinds of pleasures in Fun Home. For students of graphic design, Fun Home gives delight in its thin drawn line, its muted palette, and its impeccably detailed evocation of interior spaces and familial relationships. For those of us in literary and cultural studies, Fun Home gives great delight in its braided intertextuality. We happen upon all kinds of texts within the text, the drawn photographs, childhood diary pagers, newspapers. We track her literary references to the novels and books her father read that reference, generate, and syncopate with her own history of reading. We attend to her citations and images of a coterie of male artists and writers who were variously queer and often prosecuted for their sexuality or censored for their writings. To this male modernist legacy, Bechdel adds the legacy of lesbian writers with their manifestos, from Colette's Earthly Paradise to Word Is Out and Lesbian Nation. This graphic memoir repays reading after reading. Fun Home has now been adapted into a musical by the playwright Lisa Cron and the composer Janine Tesori. Opening off Broadway at the Public Theater in September in 2013, it will now move to Broadway and open in April. 6 years after Fun Home, Are You My Mother, a comic drama appeared. This time, Bechdel's narrator is the mature artist who is writing Fun Home. The palette is mauve, and the intertextual references of greatest valence is the life work of British pediatrician and psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott. Winnicott's theories ground Bechdel's attempt to tell a story of her mother as probing and profound as the story she told of her father. In this intriguing riff on mothering, Bechdel queers any simplistic notion of mother, child, carer, and puzzles over the ways a mother and daughter are drawn into ongoing struggles over love, desire, and aesthetic pleasures. Graphic artists, creative writers, and scholars across many fields read her, teach her, and laud her as an internationally renowned graphic memoirist. A couple anecdotes. 2 years ago, I mentored a graduate student from the University of Florianópolis in Brazil who came to the University of Michigan to work on her dissertation. Bechdel's Fun Home became its animating center. And 4 years ago, I hosted a visiting scholar from Ankara, Turkey, who audited a course I was teaching on contemporary genres of life writing. She informed us toward the end of the course that Fun Home had just been translated into Turkish. Returning to Ankara, she introduced her undergraduate students in American literature to Bechdel's family memoir. Alison Bechdel's sustained engagement with graphic storytelling earned her a 2014 MacArthur Genius Award. Please join me in welcoming Alison Bechdel. Hi!
Hello! Thank you. Hi, I'm so happy to be here at the University of Michigan. Hi. In this giant Michigan theater. Thank you all for coming. All right. There's an old saying that cartooning is a field for people who are mediocre artists and mediocre writers. And I would say that in my case, those things are pretty much true. This is one of several rejection letters I received from graduate art programs in my youth. And this is a rejection letter I received a year later from Adrienne Rich, actually, who was editing she was editing this literary magazine that I submitted a story to. But what this saying about mediocre artists and mediocre writers fails to take into account is the fact that writing and drawing together, telling stories visually, is a third thing. It's its whole own form that a person can be good at without necessarily being great at the component parts. My art by itself and my writing by itself at this point in my life totally deserve these rejection letters. But then I started combining them. And I've just always loved words and pictures together in an almost mystical way. There's something numinous to me about how, I don't know, how letter forms, this was like before I could even really write. I just loved the way numbers and letters looked mixed with my drawing. This is a Charles Addams cartoon, and the caption says, "Well, Kendrick, still think I'm an alarmist?" Charles Addams was my earliest cartoon influence. My parents had one of his books, and I would study it all the time before I even knew how to read, because I was always trying to figure out these weird scenes that he was drawing. And I kept thinking, well, eventually I'm going to learn how to read and I'm going to figure it out, but that didn't really help. This says, "We won't be late, Miss Weems. Get the children to bed around 8 and keep your back to the wall at all times." Like, what did that mean? I had no idea. So these were very baffling to me, but at the same time they were deeply familiar. I grew up in an old antique-filled house that looked very much like the world Addams was drawing. This is a panel from Fun Home. And I also grew up in a house where there were secrets and where appearances were extremely important. So Addams's cartoons were familiar to me in that way too. I was used to this sense that there was something going on that I didn't understand. There was a disjuncture between appearance and reality. So this one says, "Are you unhappy, darling? Oh yes, yes, completely." So in these cartoons, I would see my family's weird disjuncture between appearance and reality reflected back at me. There was this slippage between the words and the picture, between what Addams was saying and what you were seeing. Things didn't quite match up. And I really wanted things to match up. But what I found out as I went along through life is that nothing ever really does match up. This slippage is everywhere. Even when you try really hard to tell the exact truth, you can't, because language itself has a slippery relationship to reality. This is another scene from Fun Home. In my diary when I was 10, I started doubting whether the things I was writing were really absolutely true. And I would qualify sentences that I was worried about with these tiny little comments, "I think." And then I started going over and over them until they were blots, kind of like just to emphasize my doubt. But that started getting really time-consuming, going over and over everything like that. So I invented this sort of abbreviation, this little bird-like symbol. And I started putting that over names and places kind of as a protective spell. It became this other kind of bad luck warding off thing. There's a word for that, but I can't think of it. Anyhow, not a talisman, it's a really funny Greek word. Does anybody know that word? Apotropaic. You win. Whew. Thank you so much. That doesn't happen in every audience. Okay, so I figured if I could put that over individual names, I could also put it over the whole entry, protect the whole entry. And if I could do that once or twice, why not do that multiple times until I was pretty much obliterating the stuff I was writing. I'm telling you this because it has something to do with why I became a cartoonist. I sense that on some level, if language is unreliable and appearances are deceiving, then maybe you can sort of triangulate between both modes to get a little closer to the truth. And telling the truth remained a bit of a compulsion for me as I got older. Our big family secret was that my dad had had affairs with other men, including some of his high school students. So when I figured out I was a lesbian, I wanted to be very open and upfront about it. And soon after I got out of college, I started drawing this comic strip, Dykes to Watch Out For. Twyla is appalled to learn that Irene is a morning person. I didn't see images anywhere of women who looked like me and my friends, so I decided I would just make them myself. Another thing I really liked about working with words and pictures together was the fact that cartoons were lowbrow. They were accessible and populist, and they didn't get scrutinized the way that fine art or literary writing did, or criticized in the same way. I was very insecure as a young person after all those rejection letters. And cartoons were this like sort of judgment-free zone where you could do whatever, and nobody really cared. This was the first George Bush. This is actually from 1987, I think. Is that Holly? So I started drawing these comics, and it's sort of ironic to me now that graphic narrative over the course of my career has been embraced as this legitimate literary form and is getting a lot of exactly the kind of scrutiny and criticism that I was hoping to avoid when I started out. Whatever. So I chose this path of comics. And I chose the subject matter of lesbian feminism, which, astonishingly enough, I managed to earn a living from for a long time. The strip, everyone always laughs at that. Is it because of that woman's little hair tail? Well, anyhow, so the comic strip evolved into like an ongoing soap opera, like a continuity, a continuous story with regular characters, and I drew it for 25 years. One of my preoccupations in it was always the tension between being an outsider and being a citizen. I always liked being an outsider as a lesbian. I felt like it gave me a certain objectivity about how the world worked that I would lose if I were on the inside and benefiting tremendously from the system. But I also, of course, yearned on some deep level to just be normal, to just have everything not be such a big deal, for my queerness to be seen as normal. Oops. So the strip became a way for me to normalize my own difference. It was never about defending or explaining homosexuality, just taking that as an assumption and going on from there. It happened in real time. I would weave current events into the storyline. That was the beginning of the end. I've always been really excited by the idea that the personal is political, that our intimate lives have political significance and impact, but I'm also moved by the converse, by the idea that the political macrocosm functions a lot like our intimate relationships do, that the political is personal in a way. And one thing I would often do in my comic strip is to sort of recast current events, sort of transpose them into the domestic lives of the characters, just as a way to help myself understand things better. Like here, the mall is a microcosm of the country at this particular historic moment. It was hard. It was hard keeping up with the queer subculture. Everything was constantly changing. Identities were continually evolving. My sympathies always lay more with the characters who didn't want to assimilate and have kids and move to the suburbs. But I realized pretty early on that if this movement, if the LGBT civil rights movement actually started achieving its goals, we would kind of make ourselves obsolete. You know, there would be no more lesbian bars or gay papers or women's bookstores because there would be no need for them. We would just be like everybody else. And to a large extent, I guess that's what's happening, you know, and it's part of the reason that I stopped doing the comic strip. I didn't feel quite the same sort of urgent need to do it that I had at the beginning. Plus, for some inexplicable reason, Dykes to Watch Out For failed to cross over to a more mainstream audience. I just didn't want to have to water stuff down, you know? All right. So I kind of switched gears and I started writing these memoirs. But I feel like the memoirs, these family memoirs I've gone on to write, they carry on the same mission as the comic strip. They're very personal stories, but they're also stories about the way our most intimate selves can't escape their political contexts. In a way, the book about my father is about his pre-Stonewall coming of age, and the book about my mother is about her pre-women's liberation coming of age. And in both cases, I'm contrasting my own very different experience, having grown up on the other side of those crucial watersheds. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my process. I feel like I'm able to explain something through this combination of words and pictures that I really can't in any other way, that I can't do with just writing or just pictures. And in fact, I think of my obsessive-compulsive fifth-grade diary as sort of a very early draft of Fun Home. It was a similar attempt to pin something down that was accurate about my experience. And even now, my creative process entails a certain amount of obsession and compulsion. Oh, wait. Don't look at that yet. People always ask me, what comes first, the writing or the drawing? And it's very hard to explain, so I had to make this little video to show you. I started writing Fun Home in a word processing document, just as, you know, text, like you might start writing a screenplay. But I found that hard to, I kept hitting dead ends. I kept getting stuck on the associations between scenes and ideas. So I started writing in a drawing program in Adobe Illustrator. And here, I'm working, instead of with the one-dimensional line of a line of text that just goes across the page from left to right, I'm on the two-dimensional field of the page, and I'm thinking of it in terms of images. I'm not drawing the images yet, but I'm imagining what they're going to be. I have a little template there so I can quickly make different panel outlines. And then I just start writing on the page in a little text box. And it's very easy working like this to rearrange stuff. It's very fluid. You don't have to erase anything or throw paper out and start again. It's all on the computer. It's all virtual. And you can just play around with all these elements. If I were writing prose, this line would be fine, but because I have to draw this, I'm always fighting for space between the words and the image, so if I can make that passage one line shorter, it gives me like 1/8 of an inch more for the drawing, which is a lot. And I guess maybe it seems kind of sterile to be just working on the computer and not drawing, but I am making sketches and stuff as I do this and think about the story. Here I've scanned this sketch in, and now I'm placing it in my Illustrator document. And I've stolen other images from books or the internet just as sort of placeholders. And when I get my pages laid out, I put them into InDesign, where I can see the pages as a book, how it's all evolving. And then I print out that Adobe Illustrator page. One at a time, I print them out and just start sketching. Really rough sketches at first, pencil sketches, and then I go over them with ink. And I do a lot of posing. This is me posing as myself for this scene. This is a snapshot of me and my mother that I referred to. I look at all that stuff to refine the drawings through several drafts until I have this very tidy pencil, which I then ink and scan into the computer. Color in Photoshop. That's the little color areas. I shade it on a separate sheet of paper, scan that in, and combine it all with the text. So that's how you do it. Just do that like a couple hundred times and you have a graphic novel. I have some I don't know. I've gotten very dependent on digital photography to help me draw. This is me posing for this scene in the book about my mother. I don't always put costumes on, but sometimes I do. I didn't used to draw like this. I used to maybe occasionally sketch something, or if it was a really complicated pose I had to draw, I would take a Polaroid of it. But that was so expensive, I only did that on rare occasions. But now you can take millions of pictures for nothing, and so I do. These are, that's a pose for this scene. Here's another costume scene. I'm dressing up as Donald Winnicott, this child psychoanalyst. This is what I do all day. It's fun. So that's kind of how I do it. I sped it up a lot. So Fun Home, this book about my dad, was in many ways a book about reading. It was an attempt to read my father, to understand him through his favorite books and writers. And the memoir about my mother is a book, I think of it as a book about writing. It's about my somewhat painful and distant relationship with my mom and how writing has been a bridge for us. This is a scene in Fun Home where when I have the OCD, my mother notices, and she suggests that she will take over my diary for a while, like I'll dictate to her until my bad penmanship improved. So this was a very pivotal moment of my childhood. I see now that she saw I needed some attention and that this was a good way to give it to me. So it's such an important moment that I wrote about it again in the memoir about my mother. Here's that same diary entry cropping up again in this little scene. So one part of the memoir about my mother, one strand of it is about my mother's thwarted desire to be a writer, and the inadvertent ways that she taught me to write, and how I eventually kind of became the writer she wanted to be. So I'm going to read a short passage from Are You My Mother? Where does language come from? When I got to college, I found a lot of women asking and answering that very question. Adrienne Rich was not assigned reading for any of my classes. My new lesbian friends had turned me on to her. She was apparently a respected poet of my mother's generation, but she'd recently come out as a lesbian, a radical one, and a really smart one. I'll read this passage. I was astonished at the sense of effort. Oh, she's talking about Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. I was astonished at the sense of effort, of pains taken, of dogged tentativeness in the tone of that essay, and I recognized that tone. It is the tone of a woman almost in touch with her anger, who is determined not to feel angry, who is willing herself to be calm, detached, and even charming in a room full of men. Rich understands Woolf's detachment because she once practiced it too, she says, imitating the distance and formalism of the male poets she admired. But now she was kind of going for broke. The essay in which Rich cites A Room of One's Own covers some of the same ground as Woolf's book. Like, for example, the woman writer's peculiar challenge to cease being an object and start being a subject. One of the poems my mother was writing that winter in Germany, 7 months or so before I was born, is called La Belle Dame. It copies the form of the Keats ballad, but Mom's poem is about the woman herself, not the knight's fantasy of her. What else did my mother write? Where are her letters? Now I'm going to do something which usually I am annoyed by when other people do it, but I'm going to read these captions. My mother says, oh, wait. So the narration says, oh, no, we just read it. I left something out. I'm sorry. She's talking about Sylvia Plath. Plus, she exhausted herself making curtains. Or did I show that back here? No. Sylvia Plath exhausted herself making curtains and gingerbread. Why did she waste her time doing all that stuff? Well, I did it too. I thought it was important. I remember being very angry at Betty Friedan. What? That's me on the phone. Why? Well, she hated housework and wanted women to be independent, but then she'd hire other women to do her housework. Now, my mother says, I'm reading this fictional version of Plath's life called Wintering, and also Helen Vendler's book about poets' last works, including Plath's. You can see why Ted Hughes had to leave, her possessiveness, her demands. Hey, Mom, in my book, I say that I've never read Plath and you've never read Woolf. That's true, right? Well, I've read A Room of One's Own, but none of her novels. Of course she's read A Room of One's Own, probably in the 70s, certainly not in college in the 50s. Woolf's biographer, Hermione Lee, reports that even in the mid-60s, Woolf wasn't read in the academy, was considered a minor modernist. It was my father, not my mother, who went to grad school. When he started at Penn State, Mom was living in the village and working as a secretary. In Dad's letters to her at that time, he enlists her aid with his coursework. This letter says, my other obstacle seems small compared to this paper on Anne Bradstreet due next Wednesday. Helen, I won't be bringing any typing, but you could help me loads if you would read some of Bradstreet's love lyrics. I really hate to ask, it seems so cheap, but I'm asking. So if you could get an edition of her works, she's some goddamn Puritan who writes rather hot, passionate lines to her absent husband. Please give me some good ideas for a paper. And here's the kicker, his P.S. P.S. I know you're angry as hell, but I like to see you that way sometimes. Did she get in the book? Was she angry? Well, you'll have to read it and find out. My mother sure put up with a lot, that's for sure. I'm going to do something now, sort of that I've never done in a talk. I don't know how this is going to work. I'm going to sort of deconstruct this passage I just read to you. I'm going to go back over it. I was talking this afternoon with some creative writing students, and one topic that came up was timelines and chronological versus non-chronological storytelling. And my stories jump around crazily in time. And I feel like part of what enables me to do that, to get away with that, is that I'm writing in this visual form. So I'm just going to show you how the time works. Here, can you see that timeline at the top? So this passage that I just read, it kind of extends in time from 1928, at the time that A Room of One's Own was published, to 2010 when I wrote my memoir about my mother. So here I am in college in 1980, reading Adrienne Rich. And here is the essay I'm reading, which Adrienne Rich wrote in 1972, When We Dead Awaken, and it refers to A Room of One's Own, 1928. And here I'm imagining Virginia Woolf at Cambridge reading her essay for the first time. People could hardly hear her, they say. And just for fun, I inserted myself into this scene. I drew myself on the right, like, I figured that's probably how I would look if I was at Cambridge in 1928. Okay, then we go back to 1982. Here I am, writing up my little youthful memoir piece. I don't know what kind of memoir I could write at age 20, but I wrote a little autobiographical thing and sent it into Sinister Wisdom. Quickly got Adrienne Rich's rejection letter. Oh, I'm getting a lot of mileage out of that rejection letter. I used it at the beginning of the talk. It's in the exhibit. You can see the actual letter at the art exhibit. I guess also what I'm talking about as I show you this weird time thing is the use. It's structured also around these archival documents, around books I've read, notes I've taken, letters people have written. So that also structures this passage. So here I am getting the rejection letter. Here I am in 1983 at a lecture Adrienne Rich was giving, taking notes in my notebook. And my notebook is in the exhibit too, with these notes on her lecture. Now we're back in 2010. I'm looking at my mother's letters that my father sent her. Then we go back to 1960 when my mother is pregnant with me and typing her poems, the last poems she would write until she retired from teaching high school. 1958, my mother getting the letter from my dad, asking her to get the book. Oh, I guess I don't have the book. And now back to 2010 when I decide, Anne Bradstreet, if I'm going to write about this, I better find out about her work. So I go to a used bookstore and get a copy of her work, and I'm surprised to see who wrote the foreword. It's this very scholarly, formal introduction, but then I realize it's been under my nose the whole time. It's one of the essays in this book I've had since college on Lies, Secrets, and Silence. And on Lies, Secrets, and Silence, which was published in 1978, she adds an introductory note to her earlier Anne Bradstreet essay, sort of revising it, taking herself to task for being so scholarly and detached in the original, and confessing that, in fact, she felt a powerful personal identification with Bradstreet because she was not just a poet, but a mother. And actually, here's my mother getting the copy of Bradstreet's poetry for my dad in 1958. I just sort of imagined her in this bookstore on her lunch break. But I can't tell if she's angry or not. Anyhow, just thought I'd do that. So my memoir about my mother is actually about writing the memoir about my father and navigating that process with her. She told me many times that she wished I had written Fun Home as fiction, you know, to disguise my family and protect them. But to me, the whole point of the story is that it's true. It wouldn't have been the same story. It wouldn't have had the same meaning if it were couched as fiction. And anyway, I think it's her own fault I grew up to become a memoirist because of that intense period of the diary writing that we went through. Like, that act of writing down what you do every day became very charged for me, and now, like, that's what I do. So I grew up to be this big family secret busting memoirist. And I will end now by reading you the beginning of the book about my father, Fun Home. Chapter 1, Old Father, Old Artificer. Like many fathers, mine could occasionally be prevailed on for a spot of airplane. As he launched me, my full weight would fall on the pivot point between his feet and my stomach. It was a discomfort well worth the rare physical contact, and certainly worth the moment of perfect balance when I soared above him. In the circus, acrobatics, where one person lies on the floor balancing another, are called Icarian games. Considering the fate of Icarus after he flouted his father's advice and flew so close to the sun that his wings melted, perhaps some dark humor is intended. In our particular reenactment of this mythic relationship, it was not me, but my father, who was to plummet from the sky. But before he did so, he managed to get quite a lot done. His greatest achievement, arguably, was his monomaniacal restoration of our old house. When other children called our house a mansion, I would demur. I resented the implication that my family was rich or unusual in any way. In fact, we were unusual, though I wouldn't appreciate exactly how unusual until much later, but we were not rich. The gilt cornices, the marble fireplace, the crystal chandeliers, the shelves of calf-bound books, these were not so much bought as produced from thin air by my father's remarkable legerdemain. My father could spin garbage into gold. He could transfigure a room with the smallest offhand flourish. He could conjure an entire finished period interior from a paint chip. He was an alchemist of appearance, a savant of surface, a Daedalus of decor. For if my father was Icarus, he was also Daedalus, that skillful artificer, that mad scientist who built the wings for his son and designed the famous labyrinth. And who answered not to the laws of society, but to those of his craft. Historical restoration wasn't my father's job. It was his passion. And I mean passion in every sense of the word, libidinal, manic, martyred. Our Gothic Revival house had been built during the small Pennsylvania town's one brief moment of wealth from the lumber industry in 1867, but local fortunes had declined steadily from that point. And by the time my parents bought the place in 1962, it was a shell of its former self. The shutters and scrollwork were gone. The clapboards had been sheathed with scabrous shingles. The bare light bulbs revealed dingy wartime wallpaper and woodwork painted pastel green. All that was left of the house's lumber-era glory were the exuberant front porch supports But over the next 18 years, my father would restore the house to its original condition, and then some. He would perform, as Daedalus did, dazzling displays of artfulness. He would cultivate the barren yard into a lush, flowering landscape. He would manipulate flagstones that weighed half a ton, and the thinnest quivering layers of gold leaf. It could have been a romantic story, like in It's a Wonderful Life, when Jimmy Stewart and Donna Reed fix up that big old house and raise their family there. But in the movie, when Jimmy Stewart comes home one night and starts yelling at everyone, it's out of the ordinary. Daedalus, too, was indifferent to the human cost of his projects. He blithely betrayed the king, for example, when the queen asked him to build her a cow disguise so she could seduce the white bull. Indeed, the result of that scheme, a half-bull, half-man monster, inspired Daedalus's greatest creation yet. He hid the Minotaur in the labyrinth, a maze of passages and rooms opening endlessly into one another, and from which, as stray youths and maidens discovered to their peril, escape was impossible. Then there are those famous wings. Was Daedalus really stricken with grief when Icarus fell into the sea? Or just disappointed by the design failure? Sometimes when things were going well, I think my father actually enjoyed having a family, or at least the air of authenticity we lent to his exhibit, a sort of still life with children. And of course, my brothers and I were free labor. Dad considered us extensions of his own body, like precision robot arms. In theory, his arrangement with my mother was more cooperative. In practice, it was not. We each resisted in our own ways, but in the end, we were equally powerless before my father's curatorial onslaught. My brothers and I couldn't compete with the astral lamps and girandoles and Hepplewhite's sweet chairs. They were perfect. I grew to resent the way my father treated his furniture like children and his children like furniture. My own decided preference for the unadorned and purely functional emerged early. I was Spartan to my father's Athenian, modern to his Victorian, butch to his Nellie, utilitarian to his aesthete. I developed a contempt for useless ornament. What function was served by the scrolls, tassels, and bric-a-brac that infested our house? If anything, they obscured function. They were embellishments in the worst sense. They were lies. My father began to seem morally suspect to me long before I knew that he actually had a dark secret. He used his skillful artifice not to make things, but to make things appear to be what they were not. That is to say, impeccable. He appeared to be an ideal husband and father, for example, but would an ideal husband and father have sex with teenage boys? It's tempting to suggest in retrospect that our family was a sham, that our house was not a real home at all, but the simulacrum of one, a museum. Yet we really were a family, and we really did live in those period rooms. Still, something vital was missing. An elasticity, a margin for error. Most people, I imagine, learn to accept that they're not perfect. But an idle remark about my father's tie over breakfast could send him into a tailspin. My mother established a rule. If we couldn't criticize my father, showing affection for him was an even dicier venture. We were not a physically expressive family, to say the least, but once I was unaccountably moved to kiss my father goodnight. Having little practice with the gesture, all I managed was to grab his hand and bust the knuckles lightly as if he were a bishop or an elegant lady before rushing from the room in embarrassment. This embarrassment on my part was a tiny scale model of my father's more fully developed self-loathing. His shame inhabited our house as pervasively and invisibly as the aromatic musk of aging mahogany. In fact, the meticulous period interiors were expressly designed to conceal it. Mirrors, distracting bronzes, multiple doorways, visitors often got lost upstairs. My mother, my brothers, and I knew our way around well enough, but it was impossible to tell if the Minotaur lay beyond the next corner. And the constant tension was heightened by the fact that some encounters could be quite pleasant. His bursts of kindness were as incandescent as his tantrums were dark. Although I'm good at enumerating my father's flaws, it's hard for me to sustain much anger at him. I expect this is partly because he's dead, and partly because the bar is lower for fathers than for mothers. My mother must have bathed me hundreds of times, for example. But it's my father rinsing me off with the purple metal cup that I remember most clearly. The suffusion of warmth as the hot water sluiced over me. The sudden unbearable cold of its absence. Was he a good father? I want to say at least he stuck around, but of course he didn't. It's true that he didn't kill himself until I was nearly 20. But his absence resonated retroactively, echoing back through all the time I knew him. Maybe it was the converse of the way amputees feel pain in a missing limb. He really was there all those years, a flesh and blood presence, steaming off the wallpaper, digging up the dogwoods, polishing the finials, smelling of sawdust and sweat and designer cologne. But I ached as if he were already gone. And that's the end. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. I guess that's it. Usually I do Q&A when I'm done, so it feels weird to just walk up the stage, but that's what I have to do. So come to the thing and we can talk more. Thank you.